have very, very concise, short, powerful presentations on the 6 parallel workshops, 1 through 6, in that sequence. So please, presenters, be ready to storm the stage. Then we'll do the A, B, C, and D special sessions of Tuesday late afternoon, early night. Then we'll do semi-plenary sessions A, B, and C. And I think by then there is a chance that we'll have some feedback from the questionnaire as well. And by then we're all dead, but then Dave Batker will be taking the stage and wake us up and revive us. And I think there's one more surprise lined up for you for this afternoon. So, Sander, where are we? Should we put it up here for the speakers?
Voila.
Thank you, Sander. I would like a hand of applause for Sander. But you've been running into him everywhere in this building. You've been meeting him on internet for months, and he's been around for us any moment of the night and the day. So yeah, we would not be doing this without him. Thank you. Workshop 1. The first speaker, please. Identify and go. The clock is ticking. 3 to 5.
Okay. So 3 slides per second. Hello, I'm here on behalf of Workshop 1, which was about quantifying, mapping, modeling, and indicators of ecosystem services. We are a rather big team. You can read the name there. Rob Alkemade was also on our team. His name somehow got lost here, so we were 7 workshop organizers actually. And what we find out, we started to ask some questions in the beginning of the workshop, and the main question was, of all these presentations, how we can provide better quantifications, maps, models, and indicators actually. And we just put here some main bullet points which somehow digested out of these presentations. We did not have much time to discuss because this was a obviously a quite attractive workshop. So when we announced the call for papers for this workshop, we got something like 70 abstracts submitted. And it was our task to select finally 22 oral presentations and 35 poster presentations, which you can still see here in the room. So this was quite big demand for this topic, obviously, but it was on the cost that we had less time to discuss. So one main point concerning the indicators and models was how we can aggregate the information, the very complex information we find in the systems out there, without losing really relevant information which is needed for decision making in the end. We have to select our indicators and models so that they are more robust and sensitive to changes. We need better indicators with regard to the biophysical functions of ecosystems, regulating services, and there's still a big lack of useful indicators for this intangible and cultural ecosystem services. All these indicators and models should be sensitive to changes in the system, like for example climate change, impacts or new social dynamics. There was one talk about landscape aesthetics perception by immigrants, which are quite a relevant group of people in many countries. They might have different perceptions than the more established ones, and different ecosystem services might react differently to all these kind of changes. Of course, we have to select our study sites. We had many case studies in the presentations in order to be representative for the problem which we want to address. And there's often the problem that we have very nice concepts, nice conceptual models, but there's a problem that there are not sufficient data to quantify them, and these data which are there are often related to a high uncertainty. But on the other hand, there are so-called data-rich environments. That was taken as a quotation from one keynote. And in this data-rich environments, we really can harness the power of data which are there when they are available, long time series, which is quite nice, which showed to deliver very good and useful results. And of course, all these models and maps need a proper validation process. Then the second questions we asked ourselves or to the workshop group, how can we make these results appropriate for the stakeholders, which was also more or less the topic of this whole conference, how we can involve our results for policy and decision making, how can we make them more understandable for the users in the end. We have the problem that on the one side there are highly aggregated indicators, just like one number for a whole complex system component, and on the other hand we have very comprehensive long lists of different indicators. The question is which is more suitable, which can be better communicated to the users in the end. We did not find a real solution on this, but there were quite nice discussions actually. And the problem is that for some, if we want to calculate trade-offs, for example, in ecosystem service supply, you will not be able to work with just one indicator. So there we perhaps always will need various sets of indicators. Then the question is who's actually selecting these ecosystem services, which are to be assessed by our models and maps, and who sets the criteria and which criteria are to be set to categorize ecosystem services, but also to categorize land cover, land use, for example, which is a quite important topic when it comes to mapping of ecosystem services. Who really puts the categories? This is an agricultural field, this is a forest. This might be quite biased as well. So we want to like to find some standardized methods to categorize these different things we find out there in the nature. Then question again related to the users. Do our products we provide in our assessments, do they satisfy the needs of the people there? There we have three main topics: the engagement of the users, the scale issues, and different standards which could be derived. It would be useful to involve stakeholders and users quite from the beginning of the development of our models and indicators. We should develop appropriate user interfaces. Like in Rolf Bowman's presentation, he showed us that there are interfaces for different target groups, like for policymakers, scientists, industry people, but also just for gaming, which could really attract a lot of people to deal with these questions we have here. Of course, scale is always an important issue, time scales, spatial scales, and when it comes to the stakeholders, it would be very nice if the products we derive could match the scales of decision making actually, which often is not the case because statistics relate to other units. And we have to understand the interactions between landscape management and ecosystem service provision, of course, and develop methods which are transferable to other regions. Okay, I'm almost done. Other question is how can we use this? It's not only the stakeholder question, but also we as scientists want to develop further and improve the methods. There were many presentations about scenarios, but integration of different models and data. Expert assessment is an important tool, obviously, and use data which already are available from monitoring or statistics. And even much of these data, like satellite data, are available for free nowadays. Exploit these methods which already are there from landscape planning, landscape science, for example, use them, and explore better the spatial and temporal aspects of the really heterogeneous supply and demand of ecosystem services, and couple different methods across scales and cases. And would be very nice if we sooner or later could find a more or less common ecosystem service assessment strategy or guidelines for mapping indicators. So we would like to work on this. But it's a lot of work, of course, as was said in many presentations, and one very nice quotation was that there are many challenges, which is just another word for problems, but it's more optimistic, perhaps. So what will be the outcomes? There are already two special issues in production, one from the last ESP meeting in Salzau last year in ecological indicators, related to this quantification, modeling, and valuation topic, and another one which is right now in production about quantifying and mapping of ecosystem service in the journal with a very long name. And we plan to make two other special issues out of this workshop, one in the journal Ecological Indicators and another one in the new journal Ecosystem Services. And we would like to invite people to contribute papers to these special issues. And another thing is that we have already this ecosystem service partnership, and there's already on the website you can find topic sections related to indicators, modeling, and mapping, which will be updated by our group, and you can get information there. And what we decided finally that we would like to fund a working group on mapping, modeling, indicators, these topics, and would like to make a workshop on the next ESP meeting next year, where we will try to develop some guidelines for these common assessment strategies. So these are the major outcomes, so to say. Okay.
Thank you very much.
I'm done. Thank you.
That's with these young people, they never tire.
It was a big workshop.
Yeah. Okay, next one, workshop 2. Josh, you bring your own stuff, huh?
Yeah, unfortunately, we didn't actually organize and put together a PowerPoint presentation. Didn't realize that was any sort of expectation. So our workshop was on trade-offs and valuation, ecosystem services. And we had a few guiding questions. So our first guiding question was, can the concept of ecosystem services be useful? And the strength of this concept is it's a very useful, it raises awareness. It makes people very aware that these ecosystems provide us with vital inputs into our economy. Our economies can't function without them. It's a very useful analytical framework for research. It helps us organize our thoughts. It helps us develop good research questions, and it guides very, very important research. So these are some of the strengths of that approach. In terms of the weaknesses, there's still no common definition of what ecosystem services are and the ecosystem service concept. So there's a lot of vague approaches. It's all the benefits from nature, or it's there's some distinction between goods and services. And so people are often talking about different things. And we'll be talking about ecosystem goods and is all the raw materials from forests, and other people believe services are the functions provided by those goods. We really need to define that a little bit better. Another big weakness is it's not very clear that we're having any impact on policymakers or society. So the concept, again, it's some policymakers grasp it, it raises attention. There's been these big papers that have really called people's attention to it, but we don't see much of that transforming into policy. And we really haven't figured out the policy-science interface. How do we take our ideas and communicate them to policymakers in a way that's effective? And this is absolutely critically important, that we figure out how to educate policymakers without undermining the quality of our science. Perhaps it's our task as scientists to scientifically assess how policy decisions or how ideas make it into the policy sphere and become policy. And my view on this is actually it's not a very scientific process, that it's often who tells the best story ends up getting the policies made. It's not the hard facts and numbers, it's the storytelling. And perhaps as sustainability scientists, that should be our role, to be those storytellers. Unfortunately then, often our peers say, these aren't real scientists. It's like David Suzuki in Canada is no longer a real scientist because he tries to influence policymakers. So that's something we have to pay attention to. I would like to say that, in terms of the way forward, how do we move? In our group, I would actually argue that the Earth Economics and their SERVs, they have an approach to just a simple and effective way to value ecosystem services. It's based on benefits transfer. I don't think it's the best science out there at all. But they go to these policymakers and say, here's a list of 17 ecosystem services. Here's the values they provide. Here's how these forests prevent you from having to invest in water filtration. They prevent you from having to invest in stormwater filters. They're protecting all these things the policymakers had never thought of. The science is not necessarily the best, but just getting policymakers to think of all those benefits can have a profound impact. So I think that is one way forward. It's not the best science, but it's very effective communication. I think the real way forward, though, we have to figure out how to redesign our economic institutions so they explicitly account for ecosystem services. So we're not focused on these goals of maximizing monetary value and ever-increasing GNP, that we really got to recognize that economics is how we take what we have to create what we want, and one of those things we want is ecosystem services, and it doesn't fit into the market model, and we need those new economic institutions. So I think that's a big chunk of the way forward. Another question we asked is, how can ecosystem service values best be expressed? And as people say, there's a real limit to this monetary valuation. And I've been told many, many times that as economists we can put monetary values on anything. And my typical response to that then is, how much for your daughter? We really can't do that. So monetary valuation is seriously contested. We need to have a lot of non-monetary forms of value. We've got to look at who gets to say what type of valuation we use? Different societies have different approaches. We can't just assume that we can impose our language of Western economists. We really have to have multi-criteria approaches. His 1 minute thing threw me off. I want to get through everything. It's very, very important that we include stakeholders in this. We have a challenge of getting the right stakeholders. Ecosystems provide services at the regional, local, national, and global level. It's very challenging to pull in all those stakeholders. Decisions are often made at a more regional level. So that's a huge challenge. And the way forward perhaps is working between the economists, the social scientists, or bringing the social scientists into the mix to identify the appropriate use of stakeholders and how to integrate their views. The other big challenge is how can different approaches be aggregated? We have to look at these problems of scales over space and time. And we know that our impacts on ecosystems now will be felt in 30 years. How do we deal with that? We can't just use simple exponential discounting like economists do. What we really thought would be a good thing here is actually have a chance to have a workshop where instead of a series of presentations, we get to engage between the natural scientists and the social scientists and the economists to address these issues. Finally, since I know I'm about to get that zero time thing, we looked at what methods and tools are available. And people presented a wide range of different tools, multi-criteria analysis, conventional economic analysis, these ways to improve efficiency. And we do need this plurality of evaluation methods. We need a whole wide range. We do not know what approach works best. We've got to experiment with a lot of them. Probably at this point, still best to take the shotgun approach. How to identify that, look at the differences in values across regions. And moving forward there, again, I think we're still in that idea of shaping the paradigm. We've got the idea out there. Ecosystem services are super important. We're still really working on how to measure them. We're still developing the tools and frameworks, and I think we're on the right path, but it's still going to be the broad path until we find something that eventually works. And instead of getting kicked physically off the stage, I'll just end there, even a little incoherently. But
you'll read all about it in a new journal.
Yes. And that's the final thing is we also are going to publish our results in an issue of the new journal.
Yes. Excellent. Thank you, Josh. Number 3 is the planners group.
Yes.
Kurt, keep it short.
I will. As long as I find the presentation, I will. Yeah.
There's a mouse.
Okay.
There's a mouse.
Oh, there's a mouse. That's okay. Okay, working group 3 had the task to speak to discuss about ecosystem services in planning and management. We had a very good selection of very interesting presentations, and we also, in addition, had reserved some extra time for discussion, which was quite productive. The questions around which the discussion focused, and especially the first one, were also posed time and again, especially by my co-organizers, where is there progress for planning and management given by the ecosystem services concept, especially in comparison to earlier concepts and methodologies such as methods from landscape planning or conservation. And if there is progress, what are the most useful experiences made with applying the ecosystem services concept? And the third one, which surfaced very much in at least 2 presentations, but also in the discussion, was the question: how does the management for ecosystem services relate to the management for biodiversity? So let's look for some of the answers or some of the items that came up in the discussion. Is there progress for planning and management? Of course, in this conference, we would not say there is no progress. In fact, there is progress. Generally, yes was the answer by most persons or by all persons, but at least as I would estimate it, it was not seen as a radical break to established methodologies, but as a progress which really drives us beyond some of the weaknesses these earlier approaches had. So what are the strengths, what are the most useful experiences made with applying the ecosystem services concept? In some ways these were similar than presented in the previous presentation. And to summarize, I would say they are strongly on the procedural side of using the concept. First of all, it was emphasized time and again, it's a better communication device than we have, for example, when using merely biodiversity or some of the other goals like naturalness or whatever. Secondly, it allows also a less sectorial approach, bringing into the boat also people from disciplines and from sectors of management which haven't been involved with other concepts before, such as, for example, water managers and agricultural managers, etc. Thirdly, it can better frame and structure complex questions. We also heard that. It allows to have a more holistic view, and in terms of that, it allows to find us out some questions which we would have posed completely different in earlier approaches. It includes, by this way, also by its attractiveness, by the word service itself, and also by the mode it's handled, more stakeholder groups than just speaking about conservation, for example. And it facilitates also by this, on the ground, some solutions in getting negotiations between these stakeholder groups going. So, last but not least, how does the management for ecosystem services relate to the management for biodiversity? And the answer was that there are local and regional studies, meanwhile, and also I think there are some global ones which we didn't talk about from the Nature Conservancy and others. They show that there is a complementarity of management for these both goals, and sometimes it overlaps, sometimes it doesn't. So there's, I think the reasons are threefold. It's partly empirical, it's partly conceptual, and it's partially, of course, of the social choices and the goals we connect to it, or with the different definitions we have, for example, of biodiversity. I'll come back to that. Secondly, it is possible, as was shown, for example, in one of the studies, to identify overlap between management goals in a spatial explicit manner, and to find areas where management for the one or the other might be more advantageous and useful to invest in. Partly, of course, as I said before, the relation depends also that on our specific idea of biodiversity. If we speak about species numbers, red lists, or of specific species, which might give a completely different picture of if they come to the same result, these management methods, or not. And a word on, finally, if we are here, a last word on definition, what Josh just said. It turned out, maybe surprisingly, maybe not, that although we asked also for the different definitions of ecosystem services that people use, and they were quite various, quite different, but it turned out that it didn't seem to be a problem within one study, but it of course can be a major problem if we're trying to compare studies, bring them together, or really make studies for trade-offs and mapping and monetizing, etc. Okay, so far, thanks.
Thank you. Dolf has been impressing on me that I would give you the opportunity to ask questions to these 6 workshops once we've gone through the 6 workshop presentations. Briefly, however, it may be. Number 4, please. Eric. Okay. You have, yeah, this should be.
So here we go. So the workshop forum, financing mechanisms. We had we're very glad with how the workshop went. We had a very broad set of case studies from Latin America, from Europe, from Africa, from North America. And when we organized this workshop, we tried to address a number of challenges at both the operational level and at the theoretical level. No? So at the more operational level, some questions we made were, how can we wanted to get some conclusions on how can market forces be best used for conservation purposes. What are the key characteristics of successful financing mechanisms? Although we have to adapt to very different contexts, can we find common patterns of things which have worked in very different contexts? What should be the relative role or the relative weight of public bodies, community-based institutions, and the private sector in setting up these schemes and in taking decisions on how these schemes should run? And how can we maintain the running costs of these schemes at bearable levels? No? Also at the theoretical level, we also raise a number of questions. There's a lot of debate on whether the theory behind this sort of financing mechanisms is correct, or is it just a matter of if we're implementing, it's just a matter of institutional design of the implementations, or are parts of the theory not really correct, or there is a gap between theory and practice. Another issue which we have been addressing is this risk of motivational crowding out. Are we changing the logics by putting this sort of economic incentives? Are we eroding previously existing incentives for conservation, which may be more based on moral issues or community regulation and so on? And also the issue of environmental conflicts. No? How do we deal with the issue that, for instance, in some types of schemes like RED and so on, there's of course a very clear trade-off between uses for carbon sequestration, but also for firewood that the communities have traditionally used and that they got restricted access to that. And also the question of where should we put the limits to commodification. No? So which ecosystem services do we want to be regulated by markets, and which ecosystem service we prefer to have controlled under alternative regulatory frameworks. I'm sorry to say that we didn't got the answers to all these questions. And we finished the workshop with more questions than when we started. No? But this is not so strange, because these sort of schemes are still in a very early stage of development, and we can see there's tons of literature on this now, but much of it is still at a very theoretical level. No? So the evidence will be just be emerging in the next few years, the first evidence. So this is a knowledge frontier which we need to address. No? But a main thing which popped up during the workshop several times is that it seemed to be a very big gap between the theory of ecosystem service, of payments for ecosystem services, for instance, how we usually frame them, and what we find in reality. No? If we think, for instance, of the Bunde definition, which has been very useful so far, but when we go to the field, we see that it's very rare the case where actually these schemes fulfill those conditions. No? So there we hear more and more talking about PES-like schemes rather than PES. No? Regarding the running costs, for instance, we have to maybe to be more realistic about the amount of funding we need to for well-running schemes of PES. There's a lot of problems of corruption, for instance, in many places where PES are being implemented, and of course to control this and to monitor this has also added running costs that we, if we want to have a realist picture of this cost, we have to take that into account. No? And one of the big things, which was also raised in during the workshop, is whether we are not having a very short-sighted perspective when setting up these schemes. So the problem is, if the contract is, for instance, 6 years long, what happens then? So how can we design institutions that allow for a more long-term? I mean, what happens when the incentive is gone? No? And especially if we have changed the logic from the pre-existing motivations to conserve for the payment. If the payment is gone, what's going to happen? No? And another thing which we also raised in in the workshop was the issue of what really motivates people to engage in these sort of schemes. Because several case studies reported that it's not always just covering the opportunity cost which explains that people get involved or not. So we need some more research, some more understanding on what really motivates people to get involved in these sort of schemes. So the output. We wanted to do a short piece, a sort of policy forum. We talked to Leon yesterday, and he said that in this Ecosystem Services Journal, they are also they will also have a section for short pieces. So hopefully, if we can set up this together, we can make a short piece out of this. And we have also a special issue in preparation in Markets We Trust, contrasting views on the adequacy of market-based policy instruments in reconciling environmental protection and rural development. So then there's an open call for papers, and we really will be very happy to receive as many abstracts as possible. Thanks very much.
Excellent, thank you. And we move immediately with workshop number 5, Ecosystem Services in Policy Making and Institutional Ethics. Use a mouse.
Oh, you have to.
I have one slide somewhere.
Whoa. Okay, come and help.
This part's going to take longer than my entire presentation. There you go.
Starting now.
Starting now. Okay. I only have one slide. And you've all seen the questions and the participants in the brochure, so I wasn't going to go back over that. And it was on policy and institutional solutions, and we tried to focus on that aspect of things. And these are just some of the major, I think, takeaway messages that sort of integrate across the presentations, and I think we were all sort of headed towards, and some of the themes that I picked up in the presentations. The first one was the need for better integration, I guess, across all of the various dimensions of these problems, across different scientific disciplines, certainly, across the science policy divide, certainly, to involve practitioners in the process. Ecosystem services, I think, as a concept, requires this kind of integration, and hopefully will stimulate more integration that we haven't had in the past. How do we combine our understanding of humans with the rest of nature and recognize that they're not two separate things, but they're part of the same system? To do that, we also have to have better participation from all of these different groups. And I think it was already mentioned, and hopefully in the next conference in Portland next year, we will try to implement some of these ideas of engaging practitioners more directly, maybe having part of the conference be going out to actually work with people, on the ground, come back and report how that went. So, how do we get better focus on problem solving, and then bringing these concepts into the solution rather than coming up with a solution and then going and finding the person with a hammer to whom everything looks like a nail. We don't want to go in that direction. We also need a better long-term vision. Where is all this headed? I think one of the things that people are missing is a vision of a positive future that actually shows how we can be better off. We can all be better off if we reduce our conventional consumption, production kinds of systems and focus more on the benefits from our natural capital and our social capital and the things that are outside the market. I would like to get beyond this whole idea of talking about market-based instruments, because the instruments that we're using now for ecosystems are not really markets anyway. They're something different. So institutions need to be developed that are, I think, better suiting the situation that we face, and I've talked about that already. We need better site-specific policies. Obviously, there's no panacea here. There's no one right approach that's going to work everywhere. There are cultural differences. There are different stakeholders who have different backgrounds. So a lot of this will involve doing things on a much more site-specific basis. At the same time, we need to learn from our experiences and be able to publish and share the results of what happens at different places. So I think some of the papers in the journal, the various journals we're talking about, will help us to do that. How do we share those results without overgeneralizing, but say here's what worked here, and we should all be aware of the things that work in different places. This will allow, I think, more efficiency in the process. We also, I think, talked a lot about the burden of proof and uncertainty. We will never achieve high levels of precision, I think, in this kind of analysis, nor should we expect that, nor should we need that. But we have to recognize that uncertainty will always be there, and think about who really bears the burden of proof for that uncertainty, and make sure that we put that burden in the appropriate place so that society and sustainability and our overall well-being is enhanced, rather than smaller interest groups at the expense of the larger society. Multiple scales obviously will be necessary to build these institutional solutions. That sort of relates to the site-specific policy, so specific sites, but also multiple scales, all the way up to the global scale. And our classification and accounting systems also need to be improved, so we can do this all with more clarity. And I think that's the end, and I'm actually 30 seconds under.
Excellent. Well, the next generation of computer programs will have this clock on the screen and then close down at the install time. Simone for workshop 6.
Okay, so I was in workshop 6, which was on case studies, ecosystem services in practice. It was coordinated by James, myself, and Leon. We were looking at illustrating the richness of the ecosystem services concept. Now, I've put these little smiley faces and the sad faces to what I think we actually achieved and what we didn't achieve. So the little smiley face, yes, we certainly did illustrate the richness of the ES concept. There was multiple countries that were involved. We had presentations from Iran, Iraq, across Europe, from Hong Kong, Ethiopia. So we certainly crossed the planet with richness there. We looked across biomes and ecosystem types, from agricultural ecosystems through to wetlands, rivers, urban ecosystems, and also within and across scales. So we were working the whole range through the scales, from the property right up to the national scale. The variety of methods employed to quantify the value of ecosystem services, we certainly achieved this. We did see that there were two main frameworks that were being applied in these case studies. The Millennium Assessment and the TEEB were the most common, but there were other forms where people had taken these different frameworks and adapted them for their specific context. Maps and models, there was a whole range of maps and models that were displayed, and mapping a whole range of different things, from ecosystem functions to services to change in these dimensions, and as well as looking at pricing, dollar valuations. A lot of contingent valuation came out of this workshop, as well as well-being and scoring systems used to do the valuation of ecosystem services. What we didn't achieve, what we didn't see well within this session, was ways that the science is supporting, is really being applied out there to policy and planning. And there was two things that we were really trying to look at. One was, are these tools that we're developing actually being applied, and are they transferable to other areas? Unfortunately, we had very limited discussion within this, so I can't actually answer those questions. But if anyone else is in the room that attended these sessions, the only case study that was presented, there was only one where the research had actually hit policy, made it to the policy level. And I'd like to put my hand up with that. That was the South East Queensland Framework, hit the Statutory Regional Planning Policy in 2009. And the other question we're asking is your research being applied in the real world? And there were limited case studies that we saw that were actually really being applied. They were still quite theoretical. They may have been thesis or academic proposals, but with a great deal of potential for application out there. So we had sort of broke our session up into two. The first day on the Tuesday, as well as a poster session, and in the late Wednesday afternoon session, we looked at different types of biomes and ecosystem types. And so the main biomes and ecosystems we had presentations on were wetlands, rivers, marine grasslands and forests. As they say, this was on case studies, so we didn't have any clear defining topic, I guess, for our session. Like, it wasn't just on mapping or just modelling, so we saw a whole range of case studies on a whole lot of stuff. So we had assessments, trade-offs, issues about double counting, total economic value, restoration, landholder knowledge. Could we synthesise this? No. Do we really need to? Perhaps not, because it was a session on case studies, so that's what we were looking at. On the Wednesday, we looked at regional and urban policy and planning, and we saw two main approaches were falling out of this. The first one is people were using science, the mapping, modelling and the quantitative data to build the picture of ecosystem services in those areas. And the other groups, other people were looking at surveys and looking at some form of citizen science surveys and using that to paint the picture. So it was much more that quantitative versus qualitative type of approach. But then it sort of led us to the question of, well, what is the role of citizen science in ecosystem services assessments and programs? Is it for social learning and education, or is it to extract data and information to better inform the models and our decision makers and their understanding? So when we are using citizen science, we need to be really clear about what we're actually using, what the outcomes for, and how we actually apply that information. And so we just did develop this little diagram just to show that we needed to have these exchanges between policy and science and the science of people's perceptions and where that citizen science sort of fits into it. So in regards to the outcomes, what we're going to do with this, well, when Leon introduces the next person, I'll let Leon explain it. It will be his journal after all. So.
Thank you very much, Simone. Very